He came to visit his son's grave just like he had every Sunday for the past 3 years. But this time, someone was already there, a young waitress crying beside a child who looked hauntingly familiar. When he asked why, her answer unraveled a secret that shattered his world and gave him a reason to believe in second chances. If stories of unexpected love, quiet resilience, and the power of truth touch your heart, we invite you to stay with us. Like, share, and subscribe to Soul Moment Story for more unforgettable tales that remind us sometimes the most life-changing encounters happen in the quietest places. The snow had come early that year. Montana in January was unforgiving, even for those who'd grown up wrestling cattle and digging fence posts with bare hands. But Sawyer Ellison had always liked the silence snow brought. It muffled the noise of the world, the weight of memory, the ache of the empty house behind him. He pulled his worn canvas coat tighter around his frame and stepped through the iron gate of Edgewood Cemetery boots, crunching against the snow-blanketed gravel path. A bouquet of white roses trembled in his gloved hand. 3 years, 3 winters without Jack. He knew exactly how many steps it took to reach the grave. 73. He'd counted them the first winter when his knees buckled halfway there. But today, something was off. Halfway up the hill, Sawyer slowed. There, just ahead at Jack's grave, someone was kneeling. A woman. She wore a white apron over a dark green coat, the kind waitresses wore at small-town diners. Snow clung to her shoulders. In her arms was a little girl no more than 3, both of them huddled against the wind. Sawyer stopped cold. The child was crying softly, face buried in the woman's chest. But what stunned him wasn't the sobbing. It was when the little girl turned her face, just slightly just enough for him to see her eyes. Green. Wide. Familiar. Jack's eyes. Sawyer's chest tightened. He took a step forward. "Excuse me," he said, voice low but firm. "This is a private grave." The woman startled and turned. Her cheeks were blotched from the cold and from tears. Her eyes, hazel steady, met his. She held the child closer. I'm sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't know anyone would be here." Sawyer stood still. "You're at my son's grave." She nodded as if bracing herself. "I know." The wind cut between them like a blade. For a moment they said nothing. Then the little girl looked up at Sawyer again, and something in him cracked. "What's your name?" he asked. The woman stood slowly, her boots unsteady on the snow. "Clara. Clara Winfield." He nodded toward the child. "And her Ellie." Ellie. Even the name hit him like a bruise. He tried to steady his voice. "Why are you here?" Clara hesitated. Then she gently lowered Ellie to the ground, smoothing the child's hair as the little girl clung to her coat. "I come here every year, on this day." Why this day, Sawyer asked, though he already knew. Clara's lips trembled. Because 3 years ago today, Eleanor died giving birth to Ellie. And Jack, her voice faltered. He was her father. Sawyer froze. The snow around them seemed to pause midair. The wind, the gray sky, the sharpness of the air, all of it collapsed into silence. "That's not possible," he said slowly. "Jack never told me, he never mentioned." "I know," Clara whispered. "He didn't tell anyone. Not after what happened between him and your family. After your father, after James Sr. threatened Eleanor to stay away, Jack promised he'd keep them safe." Quiet. Sawyer's breath turned to frost. His fingers clenched around the rose stems. "She never wanted to hide Ellie from you," Clara continued. "But after Eleanor died, I raised her. I made a promise to both of them. And I kept it." Ellie, now playing silently near the edge of the grave, began brushing snow from a small pile of pebbles. She stacked them carefully like a child who understood ceremony. Sawyer crouched, suddenly unable to stand. His hands trembled. "She's his daughter." Clara nodded. "I wouldn't lie about something like this." He looked at Ellie again. Really looked. The high cheekbones, the dimple in her left cheek, the way she turned her head just like Jack used to when he was concentrating. "I don't know what to say," Sawyer murmured. "You don't have to say anything," Clara said softly. "I didn't come here to ask for money or help. I bring her here every year so she knows where her father is. So she remembers." Sawyer exhaled, broken. "Does she know?" he asked. "She knows he's her dad," Clara replied, "and that he was kind, brave, that he would have loved her if he had the chance." Sawyer closed his eyes. 3 years he'd spent coming to this grave, talking to the silence, pouring out words to a boy he missed so fiercely it hurt to breathe. And now in front of him stood a living, breathing extension of that boy, a little girl who had Jack's eyes and Eleanor's grace. "I'd like to see her again," he said. Finally, his voice raw. Clara's expression hardened slightly. "I'm not sure that's a good idea." "Why not?" "Because your family pushed Eleanor away. Because she died, thinking she wasn't good enough. I won't let anyone hurt Ellie like that." Sawyer's voice sharpened. "I'm not my father." Clara stared at him for a long moment. Then she softened. "No. Maybe you're not." They stood in the snow, the three of them surrounded by rows of stone and silence. And for the first time in years, Sawyer Ellison didn't feel entirely alone. He glanced at Ellie. "What is she doing?" Clara smiled faintly. "She's leaving a gift." Ellie placed a small red mitten on the headstone, then stood back and nodded solemnly. Sawyer swallowed the lump in his throat. "I don't know what happens next," he said. "Neither do I," Clara replied. But neither of them moved, and the snow kept falling soft and steady like the hush before something new begins. Sawyer sat on the edge of his bed that night, boots still on hands buried in his hair. The house was dark, save for the low flicker of firelight in the hearth. Shadows danced across the framed photo of Jack on the mantel, 8 years old, grinning arms full of a stray puppy he'd found behind the feed store. That same grin had vanished far too soon, swallowed by tragedy Sawyer never fully understood. And now, Ellie, his granddaughter. He hadn't spoken a word to anyone since leaving the cemetery. He'd driven home in silence, snow blowing sideways across the windshield, his knuckles white around the steering wheel. Even now, hours later, he couldn't shake the image of that little girl, those eyes, those dimples, that mitten on the gravestone. Jack's child. Sawyer leaned forward and rested his elbows on his knees. Grief had a way of returning like a ghost, quiet and cruel. But tonight, it was grief mixed with wonder and guilt. Why hadn't Jack told him? Why had Eleanor kept it hidden, unless they'd never had the chance? His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. He frowned. No one came out this far, especially after dark. When he opened the door, Clara was there wrapped in the same coat and scarf, holding a plastic grocery bag against her chest. Ellie stood beside her, clutching a small, stuffed rabbit. "I hope it's not too late," Clara said softly. Sawyer stepped back. "Come in, it's freezing." They entered cautiously. Clara's eyes scanned the room, settling briefly on Jack's photograph. She looked down, her expression unreadable. "I didn't come to argue," she said. Ellie couldn't sleep. She asked about him. Sawyer knelt beside the little girl. "Hey, sweetheart." Ellie looked up shyly. "You're the man with the sad eyes." He smiled faintly. "I suppose I am." "I brought something," Clara said, reaching into her bag. She pulled out an old, worn envelope, edges curled from time and handling. Sawyer's breath caught. "She wrote it after she found out she was pregnant," Clara explained. Eleanor never mailed it, but she kept it in a shoebox with Jack's letters, old sonograms, and notes. After she passed, I kept it safe. I didn't think you'd ever want to see it until today. Sawyer took the envelope with trembling hands. His name was on the front, in careful, slanted cursive. He stared at it for a long moment. Then silently, he moved toward the fireplace, sat in his worn chair, and opened the letter. Clara stood by the door, holding Ellie's hand, as Sawyer read. Dear Sawyer, I don't know if you'll ever see this. I'm not even sure I'll send it. But I needed to write it. Jack deserves better than silence. I'm pregnant. It's his. I know how this looks. I know what your father will say. I know what people will assume. But please believe me, we loved each other. Jack wasn't just kind. He was good. He had a fire in him that made me feel safe even when the world didn't. I've never asked you for anything. I'm not asking now. I only want our child to know peace. If that means raising them far from the Ellison name, then so be it. But I want you to know, Jack wanted to be a father. He told me the day before he left for Colorado that he was ready. He said he wanted to build a life that had room for all of us. If anything happens to me, please find our child. Tell them their father was brave. Tell them he chose love over legacy. That's all I ask. With hope, Eleanor. By the time Sawyer finished reading, his vision had blurred. He folded the letter carefully and pressed it to his lips. I never knew, he whispered. I believe you, Clara replied gently. Sawyer turned to her, voice hoarse. He was trying to tell me. And God, I was too wrapped up in my own grief to ask questions. Ellie yawned and curled against her mother's leg. Sawyer knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. She looks just like him, he said. Clara nodded. But she has Eleanor's calm, her quiet strength. Sawyer looked at Clara, then not just as the caretaker of his granddaughter, but as the keeper of a truth that had waited 3 years in the dark. He saw the lines of fatigue beneath her eyes, the steadiness in her voice. This wasn't a woman who had run from responsibility. She had embraced it in its purest, hardest form. I want to be part of her life, he said quietly. Clara's shoulders tensed. I don't know what that looks like yet. I'm not asking for custody. I'm not asking for anything but a chance to know her, to know you, to honor what Jack and Eleanor wanted. She studied him for a long moment. What if your father finds out? Sawyer's jaw tightened. Then let him. He's already taken enough. Clara nodded slowly. I'll think about it. She gathered Ellie in her arms, but paused at the door. There's more, she said. About Eleanor, about your father. Things I promised I'd keep quiet until the time was right. Sawyer's gaze sharpened. What kind of things? Clara hesitated. Things you deserve to know, but not tonight. She opened the door, letting in a gust of icy wind. Sawyer watched her go, the letter still clutched in his hand. Outside, the snow continued to fall soft, steady, and silent. But for the first time in years, he knew something was changing. And it had begun with a letter never sent, but never forgotten. The morning came pale and bitter. A low mist hung over the pastures of the Ellison ranch, softening the fences and stables into ghost-like outlines. Sawyer stood at the edge of the field, steam rising from his coffee as he stared into the white void. He hadn't slept. Not really. The letter from Eleanor lay folded neatly in his breast pocket like a pulse against his heart. He'd read it 3 more times after Clara left. Each word pressed deeper into him, not just guilt, but awakening. There had been so much he hadn't seen, hadn't asked. And now the answers were resting in a little girl's face and a woman's tired strength. He set the mug down on the railing and went back inside. Jack's room hadn't changed in 3 years. Everything was where it had been on the day he died. The guitar by the window, the The boots by the bed, the drawer full of half-finished notebooks, each page filled with sketches, lyrics, ideas that would never come to life. Sawyer pulled open the bottom drawer. At first he wasn't sure what he was looking for, only that something was pulling at him. And then he saw it. Tucked beneath a stack of old comic books was a plain manila envelope. No name. No label. But the seal had been broken. He opened it carefully. Inside were photos, grainy, slightly out of focus. Jack and a girl. Not Clara. This one had dark eyes, a warm smile, wind-tangled hair. They were sitting by a creek, barefoot, laughing. Eleanor. Sawyer's breath caught. There was something in Jack's eyes in these pictures, a piece Sawyer hadn't seen since before his son turned 18. A boy in love. Behind the photos was a folded sheet of paper, a scanned document, a will. Jack had handwritten it. Signed, dated 3 weeks before the accident. If anything happens to me, I want my daughter, Ellie Reese, to be placed in the custody of Clara Winfield, who has cared for Eleanor and stood by us when no one else did. Sawyer dropped into the old desk chair, stunned. It was real. His son had known, had planned, had trusted Clara. And Sawyer, he hadn't even known the name Eleanor Reese until yesterday. He ran his fingers through his hair, the old floor creaking beneath his boots. The weight of those lost years pressed down like a physical thing. Then a thought rose in his mind, one that chilled him more than the Montana winter outside. Why hadn't Jack told him? Why keep it secret? The answer came uninvited and unwelcome. James Ellison Sr. That afternoon, Sawyer stood before a different grave. It was newer set apart from the Ellison family plot in a corner, where the grass always seemed a little thinner. A simple stone. Eleanor Reese, 1993, 2020. She loved in silence. She left in light. There were no flowers, no trinkets, just snow and quiet. Sawyer knelt and brushed the ice from the base. I didn't know, he said softly, but I should have. He looked around as if expecting the wind to answer. My father, he never said anything. About you, about the baby. And Jack, he wanted to protect you from this place. I see that now. He swallowed, but he shouldn't have had to. And neither should you. He stayed there a long time, letting the stillness speak. Then, in the hush of snow and stone, he heard a voice. You found her. Sawyer turned. Clara stood a few yards away, bundled in a wool coat, Ellie's small hand wrapped in hers. I wasn't sure you would, she said. I had to, he replied. I needed to see where Jack's story really ended. Clara stepped forward. Ellie ran ahead, kneeling beside the grave. She pulled a candy cane from her coat pocket and set it gently against the stone. She says Eleanor liked peppermint, Clara said, managing a small smile. Sawyer crouched beside her. She brought her a gift yesterday, too. The mitten. She says gifts help people remember. He looked at Ellie. She's right. Clara stood in silence for a moment before speaking. There's something you should know, she said. About James. Sawyer stood. I've been wondering. Clara hesitated. Then, when Eleanor told him she was pregnant, he threatened her. Said if she went public, he'd destroy her. He had connections money. She was 26, living paycheck to paycheck, terrified of raising a child alone. Sawyer's face darkened. He did that. Clara nodded. She didn't want to hide. But she also didn't want Ellie to grow up hated. She told Jack. He promised to protect them. They were making plans. Jack even talked about leaving Montana altogether. Why didn't he tell me? Sawyer asked, voice low. Clara looked him in the eye. Maybe he didn't think you'd believe him. Or maybe he was afraid you'd side with your father. Sawyer took a long breath. That's not who I am, he said. I know that now, Clara replied. But back then it was hard to see where Jack ended and the Ellison legacy began. He glanced at Ellie. She was quietly humming tracing letters in the snow. "I want to do right by her," he said. "And by Eleanor. And Jack." Clara's voice softened. "Then start by protecting her future. Because James is going to find out. And when he does, he won't stay quiet." Sawyer's jaw tightened. Let him come. That night, as Clara tucked Ellie into bed at the small apartment above the diner, she glanced at her phone. A message lit the screen. Unknown number. 2 words. "We need to talk." She stared at it for a long moment, heart steady. Then she deleted it. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, shaking the windows. But inside, Ellie slept in peace. And Clara began to plan. The diner smelled like burnt coffee and second chances. It was just past 3 p.m., and the usual post-lunch lull had settled over the Bellevue diner like a soft coat of dust. A few locals sat hunched over their mugs at the counter, and an old Christmas tune crackled faintly from the radio near the register, though it was already mid-January. Clara refilled the napkin dispensers by muscle memory. Her eyes, however, kept drifting to the booth in the far corner, the one facing the window, the one she'd reserved in her mind for only one kind of visitor. And then right on cue she arrived. Margot Yates. The woman slid into the booth with the kind of confidence born not from arrogance, but survival. Early 50s, sharply dressed, but unassuming, the kind of woman who could disappear into a crowd or dismantle a lie with one sentence. A leather satchel rested beside her, like a loyal dog. Clara walked over, apron still tied at her waist. "You came," she said. Margot nodded, eyes scanning the diner with practiced detachment. "It's been a while. 3 years." Margot smiled faintly. "And yet, here we are." Clara placed a cup of coffee on the table. "Still black, no sugar. You remember?" Clara sat across from her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I wouldn't have called if it wasn't important," Clara said. "I need your help." Margot took a sip. "Then tell me everything." And Clara did. She told her about Eleanor, about Jack, about the birth, the threats from James Ellison Sr., and the funeral that had no Ellisons in sight, about Sawyer, about the letter, the pictures, the will, the silent war she'd been fighting with nothing but exhaustion and faith. When she finished, Margot leaned back and let out a long breath. "Well," she said, "you've been busy." Clara gave a tight laugh. "I've been surviving. You've also been playing the long game. I didn't have a choice." Margot nodded slowly. "So why now? Why not come to me when Eleanor died? Because I needed to know Sawyer wasn't like his father. And because I didn't want to make Ellie a weapon. She's a child, not a headline." Margot's gaze softened. "You've grown into someone Eleanor would be proud of." Clara blinked hard. "I hope so." A silence passed between them before Margot pulled out her satchel and placed a slim folder on the table. "I started digging again after your message," she said. "James Ellison Sr. is still doing what he always did. Land grabs, zoning violations, illegal tax shelters. But lately, he's been sloppy, arrogant. There's one case in particular, a land swap near Bitterroot Lake. Dozens of displaced families forged signatures, hush money. It's dirty. And it's recent." Clara leaned in. "Do you have proof?" Margot tapped the folder. "Photos, depositions, 2 whistleblowers. If you want to bring heat, this is your matchstick." Clara hesitated. "What about Sawyer? What about him?" "He's not his father. He's trying," Margot considered. "Then you'd better tell him soon. Because once this goes public, no one named Ellison is walking away clean." Clara opened the folder slowly. Page after page of hard truth stared back at her signed affidavits, redacted emails, aerial photos of bulldozed properties. Ellie's future, Eleanor's justice. All of it was here. But so was the risk of burning every bridge she'd just begun to cross. "You sure you're ready for this?" Margot asked. Clara looked out the window. Across the street through the glass, she saw Sawyer's truck pull up. He didn't see her. He stepped out and headed into the general store. Next door, his tall frame slightly hunched, as if the Montana winter was still trying to knock him down. Clara turned back to Margot. Her voice was steady. "I didn't survive all this just to settle for peace. I want the truth, and I want it loud." Margot smiled. That's the Clara I remember. Later that evening, Clara returned home to find Ellie asleep on the couch. Sawyer sitting beside her, a coloring book open in his lap. He looked up as Clara entered. "She said she wanted to draw a horse," he said. "But I think it turned into a dragon halfway through." Clara smiled faintly. "She does that." They stood in silence for a moment, the soft crackle of the fireplace filling the space between them. "I saw someone today," she said finally. "A journalist. Someone who helped Eleanor once. She's got files, proof of what your father's been doing. Not just to Eleanor, but to a lot of people." Sawyer's jaw tightened. "I believe you. I'm thinking of going public." He nodded slowly. "Then I'll back you." Clara looked at him surprised. "Just like that?" "You shouldn't have to carry this alone," he said, "and neither should Ellie." She stepped closer. "You know your father won't take this quietly. I'm not afraid of him anymore." Their eyes met, not as adversaries, not even yet as allies, but as two people standing at the same cliff's edge, looking not at the fall, but at the climb ahead. "I need to know something," Clara said. "Anything. Are you doing this because of guilt, or because you believe in what Jack and Eleanor tried to build?" Sawyer didn't hesitate. "Because I believe in her." Clara didn't ask which her he meant. She already knew. The letter came without a stamp. No return address. No markings. Just a folded sheet of creamy stationery slid under Clara's apartment door sometime before sunrise. She found it when she opened the door to take out the trash and nearly stepped on it, the Ellison family crest pressed faintly into the top corner like a scar. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she placed it on the counter next to the bowl of overripe peaches and Ellie's watercolor painting of a house with 4 stick figures, one of them taller than the others, with Sawyer's familiar cowboy hat. The air felt heavier with it in the room. An hour later, she sat down, drew in a breath, and unfolded the page. "Ms. Winfield, we should meet. 1 o'clock, the conservatory behind the Ellison estate. Come alone. It's time we discussed what's best for the child. James Ellison Sr." She read the note twice. Then she burned it over the sink. At exactly 12:58, Clara walked through the iron gate behind the Ellison estate. The conservatory was a relic, glass-framed walls and crumbling stone pathways choked with dormant vines. Once a proud tribute to the Ellison name, it now stood like a forgotten monument to everything they'd tried to hide. James Ellison Sr. was already waiting. He sat beside an iron table with a steaming cup of tea in front of him, pristine, in a wool coat, leather gloves on the bench beside him. His white hair was slicked back, and a gold signet ring gleamed on his finger. Clara had seen photos, but seeing him in person was like stepping into a colder version of Sawyer, a version sharpened by privilege and polished by cruelty. "You're punctual," he said without looking up. "You asked for a meeting," Clara replied, her voice flat. "Let's not pretend this is polite." James finally looked at her. His eyes, icy and unreadable, narrowed slightly. "You look nothing like Eleanor." Clara didn't blink. "That's probably why you agreed to meet me." A smirk twitched at the corner of his mouth. "I'll admit you've handled this more elegantly than I expected. For someone who was pouring coffee for truckers a few months ago." Clara stepped closer. "Get to the point." James's tone shifted syrup thick with calculation. "You're a bright woman, capable." I read the transcript from the court hearing in 2020, the one where you testified on behalf of Eleanor. You were compelling, emotional, but restrained. You knew exactly how much to reveal. Clara crossed her arms. I was telling the truth. Truth, James mused, swirling his tea. A quaint word. He stood finally facing her. Let me offer you something far more valuable, Resolution. I'm listening. You walk away. Disappear. Take the child, change her name, and we forget any of this ever happened. In exchange, I offer you a one-time payment of $250,000. Untaxed. Off the books. You and the girl can vanish into whatever quiet little life you want. I'll make sure you're safe. Protected. Clara stared at him. You think this is about money? He shrugged. Everything is about money. She took a slow step forward. Ellie is Jack's daughter. She belongs to the family he wanted to build, not the one he spent his life escaping. James's face tightened. You've read his will, then. I've read a lot of things. James stepped closer, eyes sharp. And yet you haven't brought it to court, because you know it won't hold. You think Eleanor's word carries weight. A waitress, a single mother with no formal degree, no legacy, no name. Clara didn't flinch. You mean someone you thought wouldn't fight back. His voice dropped to a dangerous hush. This isn't just about a child anymore, Miss Winfield. You've stirred things, brought journalists into places they don't belong. If this becomes public, people will suffer. And not just you. Clara took a breath. That's a threat. It's a warning, he said coolly. There's still time to make this clean. Or what Clara said, her voice low and steel-hard. You'll do to me what you did to Eleanor. Destroy her quietly. Push her so far into the shadows that no one remembers she existed. James said nothing. But the silence was louder than a confession. You underestimated her, Clara said. And now you're underestimating me. James's smile returned brittle and bloodless. Then I suppose I'll see you in court. Clara turned to leave but paused. You may own land, Mr. Ellison, but you don't own truth, and you don't own Ellie. His voice followed her as she walked away. We'll see about that. That night, Clara told Sawyer everything. They sat in his kitchen, Ellie asleep upstairs, the fire casting flickering shadows on the floor. He offered you money, Sawyer asked, his voice tight. Clara nodded, said I could walk away, start over. And I burned the letter. He closed his eyes, jaw clenched. He won't stop. Clara's voice was steady. Then neither will I. Sawyer looked at her, really looked, and saw not the waitress from Bellevue Diner, but the woman who'd raised his granddaughter, kept his son's legacy alive, and now stood ready to face a man like James Ellison, with nothing but truth in her corner. He stood and crossed the room, opened a drawer, and placed a small black notebook on the table. Clara frowned. What's that? Sawyer opened it. Inside were pages of Jack's handwriting, sketches, ideas, and something else. Journal entries. He kept this the last year of his life, Sawyer said. I never read it. I couldn't. But maybe now. Maybe it's time. Clara picked it up gently. At the bottom of the first page, Jack had scrawled a line, "Love is the only legacy worth fighting for." They said nothing more that night. But the war had begun, and Clara Winfield was ready. The folder was heavier than it looked. Clara sat at the far end of Margot Yates's tiny living room, the stack of documents resting on the coffee table between them like a silent witness. Outside, snow continued falling over the town of Bellevue, softening rooftops and covering even the ugliest secrets in a blanket of quiet. But nothing could soften what lay inside that folder. Margot poured coffee without asking. Clara didn't touch hers. We start with Eleanor, Margot said, settling onto the couch. The deposition she gave me 3 months before her death. You need to hear her words and her voice." Clara nodded. Margot pulled out a flash drive and inserted it into the side of her laptop. A moment later, the screen flickered to life, showing Eleanor Young, nervous but determined. She wore a cardigan Clara remembered from long ago, the one she always wore when she felt vulnerable. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap. "He told me I'd ruin everything if I didn't disappear." Eleanor's voice trembled slightly. "He said the Ellison name had no room for scandal, that I'd never survive what he could do to me." Clara clenched her fists. "I didn't want Jack to know," Eleanor continued. "I didn't want him to hate his father. But when I found out I was pregnant, I had to tell someone. I told Clara. She was the only one I trusted. She kept me sane." Margot paused the video. "Why didn't you come forward with this before?" Clara asked quietly. "Because Eleanor begged me not to." She was scared, Clara, not just of James, but of what exposing him would mean for Jack. She wanted her daughter to grow up safe, even if it meant growing up in silence. Clara looked away. And instead, she died alone. With no justice. "Not anymore," Margot said. "But if we do this, we go all in. We don't just accuse James of coercion. We go after the paper trail." She reached into her satchel and pulled out another file. "Here," she said, laying out a series of printed emails and financial statements. "This is the land transfer outside Bitterroot. 22 acres sold to a shell company for 1/3 of its value. A month later, that same land was sold again, at triple the price to a construction firm owned by one of James's longtime associates." "Money laundering," Clara whispered. "Textbook," Margot confirmed. "And I've got 2 whistleblowers willing to talk. One of them used to work in the Ellison legal office. She claims she was ordered to destroy files related to Eleanor's non-disclosure agreement." Clara looked up, startled. "There was an NDA signed under duress. Eleanor never told you, did she?" "No, she didn't want you to worry. But the signature's on file. I've already had it authenticated." Clara let out a slow breath. "So what now?" Margot leaned forward, her voice measured but firm. "Now we build a case. A real one. Federal. You Sawyer myself, and one hell of a civil rights attorney I've got on standby. If we play it right, this doesn't just end with James losing his grip on Ellie. It ends with him losing everything." A knock interrupted them. Clara opened the door to find Sawyer standing in the hallway, coat dusted with snow. He held up a spiral-bound notebook. "I found something," he said. Back in Margot's living room, Sawyer laid the notebook on the table. "It's Jack's. He kept it hidden in the barn loft, tucked under some old hay bales. I think he was trying to gather proof. Inside were handwritten notes, messy sketches, phone numbers, and dates. On one page, Jack had drawn a family tree with Eleanor's name and Ellie's circled in red. But what caught Clara's eye was a scribbled phrase on the last page. "If I don't make it, Clara has to know. Dad deserves the truth. Ellie deserves the name." Clara's hands trembled as she read it aloud. Sawyer sat beside her. He was going to come forward. He just ran out of time. Clara looked at him. "Are you ready to do this? Once we start and there's no going back, James will bury us if he can." "I let my son walk through hell alone," Sawyer said. "I won't let my granddaughter grow up in a lie." Margot nodded, satisfied. "Then we begin." She stood and crossed the room to a filing cabinet. From the bottom drawer, she pulled out a thick manila envelope. Inside are statements, photographs, records that should have been destroyed, but weren't. Copies of transactions from 4 different Ellison-affiliated companies, all tied to fraudulent deals. "This," she said, placing it firmly on the table, "is the case they buried." Clara opened the envelope and stared. Her hand stopped on one photo, James Ellison Sr., shaking hands with a local judge, an envelope between them. "I know that man," she said. "He presided over Eleanor's eviction hearing." "Exactly," Margot replied. "The web runs deeper than just land and money. It's political. It's systemic. But it has cracks, and we're going to pull it apart thread by thread." Clara took a breath and closed the envelope. Outside, the snow fell thicker, but inside the room, something had shifted. Not just resolve, but momentum. The truth had waited long enough. The envelope was thick official and waiting on Clara's doorstep at dawn. She recognized the letterhead before she picked it up. Ellison and Varnett attorneys, at law, printed in crisp serif across ivory paper. No need to open it. She already knew what it said. They were coming for Ellie. Sawyer stood behind her coffee, steaming in his hand, the frown on his face carved deep enough to be permanent. "They filed?" he asked. Clara nodded, her throat dry. "Emergency petition for custody, claiming I'm unfit." Sawyer took the envelope from her gently, as if it might shatter in his grip. He opened it and scanned the first page. Citing emotional instability, inadequate housing, lack of formal guardianship documentation, he read aloud, and he paused. Exposure to a potentially hostile media environment. Clara gave a humorless laugh. So now the truth is a threat to the child. "They're spinning it," he muttered. "Classic Ellison tactic. Make you the problem so they never have to explain themselves." Clara leaned against the doorframe, arms folded tight. "He's coming for her, Sawyer, and he's not doing it quietly." Sawyer met her eyes. "Then neither will we." By noon, the local news had the headline, "Custody Battle Erupts Over Heir to Ellison Legacy," with an old photograph of Jack Ellison smiling next to a blurred image of a young child in a car seat. The media frenzy had officially begun. Clara stared at the screen in Margot's living room. Numb. "I didn't even know that photo existed," she whispered. "They probably scraped it off an old DMV database or hospital record." Margot said, pacing. "They're framing it as a concerned grandfather stepping in for the sake of the child's well-being. Well, that concerned grandfather threatened Eleanor into hiding and bribed a judge to have her evicted," Clara snapped. "But I suppose that doesn't make for good television." Margot turned, face grim. "They're playing the sympathy card. Old money, a dead son, a family name at stake." Clara's jaw tightened. They forgot the most important piece. Ellie. Margot nodded. "She's not a legacy. She's a little girl, with real memories and real feelings. And that," Margot said, "is exactly what we need the public to see." 2 days later, Clara sat across from a civil rights attorney named Desmond Hale in a glass-walled office in downtown Missoula. He was in his late 40s, black, impeccably dressed, and had the calm demeanor of someone who'd stared down power more than once, and won. He opened the file Margot had sent him, flipping through documents with quiet efficiency. When he reached the custody petition, he snorted. "This is weak," he said. Clara blinked. "It is." "Oh, it's dangerous," Desmond clarified. "But it's desperate. They're relying on perception, not facts. Unfortunately, that's often enough." He turned to her. "The key is building your narrative. Controlled, consistent, compassionate. You've already got a rock-solid foundation primary caregiver, since birth documented connection to both parents, the child's stability and well-being intact." "And the Ellison money?" Clara asked. Desmond leaned back. "You can't outspend them, but you can outstory them. This isn't just a legal fight. It's emotional, public, symbolic. And if we want the judge and the court of opinion to see Ellie as a person and not a pawn, we have to put her voice at the center." He pushed a document across the table. "I want to request a child advocate psychologist, someone neutral to evaluate Ellie's emotional attachment and needs. If she identifies you as her primary emotional support, and she will. That weighs heavily." Clara nodded. "What about Sawyer?" Desmond smiled. "A reformed Ellison who supports you over his own father. That's narrative gold. But more than that, it's human. A man who lost a son and is choosing truth over legacy. People respond to that." Clara exhaled. "You really think we can win this?" Desmond's voice softened. "I don't take cases I plan to lose." That night, Clara tucked Ellie into bed and sat at the foot of the mattress as the little girl clutched her stuffed rabbit. "Mommy," Ellie whispered, "why are people taking pictures of us at the store?" Clara's heart ached. "Because there are people who want to know more about you and your daddy, and some of them don't understand." Ellie's brow furrowed. "Did I do something bad?" "No, baby," Clara said, brushing her daughter's hair. "You're the best thing in the world. That's why we're fighting. So you can grow up safe and loved. Will I still have my room? And Mr. Rabbit?" Clara smiled. "You'll have everything that matters, I promise." Meanwhile, in his estate office, lit by brass lamps and generations of silent oil portraits, James Ellison Sr. took another call. "No, I don't care what the polls say," he said sharply. "She's a waitress with no degree and a child born out of wedlock. Don't talk to me about optics. Talk to me about leverage." He hung up without waiting for a reply. Across the room, David Varnett, his lead attorney, hesitated. "Sir, if I may, the press is beginning to question the authenticity of the emergency filing. Some legal analysts are pointing to the lack of evidence against Ms. Winfield." James turned slowly cold fury behind his measured tone. "Then we give them evidence." Varnett blinked. "What kind of evidence?" "Find something. Invent something. I don't care. But if you let that girl win, it's not just my name on the line. It's every deal we've buried in the last 20 years. Outside, snow began to fall again. Back in Sawyer's kitchen, Clara poured herself a cup of tea, while he scanned another round of legal documents Desmond had sent over. "You okay?" he asked. "I think so," she replied. "I'm mostly just tired of fighting. But I'm more tired of losing." He nodded. "Ellie's strong. You made her that way." Clara met his eyes. "She's strong because she has roots now. Not just memories. People. Home." Sawyer stepped closer, his voice low. "Then let's make sure no one ever pulls them up again." The cassette tape was inside an old, leather-bound Bible tucked between the pages of Psalms and Ecclesiastes, wrapped in a faded envelope, bearing only one word, written in Jack's unmistakable scrawl. "For her." Clara's fingers trembled as she held it. The Bible had been buried in the barn's rafters behind a stack of dusty gardening tools. Sawyer had found it while replacing a rotten beam. "I don't remember him ever reading it," he'd said quietly. "But I remember the day he asked to borrow it. Said he needed something safe to hide something sacred." They sat together now in Sawyer's kitchen, the winter storm tapping against the windows, a tape recorder resting on the table, like an artifact from another time. Clara took a breath and pressed play. Soft crackle, then Jack's voice. "If you're hearing this, I guess I didn't get the timing right. Which, if you knew me, wouldn't surprise you. Clara, I've watched you carry more than your share of weight in this world. You were there when Eleanor had no one else. You stayed when even I couldn't. You held Ellie in your arms before I ever did, and I don't know if I'll ever be able to say this in person, but thank you. For loving her, for protecting her, for saving both of them." Clara's eyes stung. Sawyer reached for her hand, steady and silent. "I know what my father did. To Eleanor. To me. I spent years trying to make peace with the Ellison name, and all I ever found was silence. But the day I held Ellie, that changed. Suddenly it mattered. Suddenly the name wasn't about money or legacy. It was about her. And I need you to promise me something. If something happens to me, if I can't be there, don't let them take her. My father will come. He'll try to make it look clean, legal, maybe even noble. But it won't be for her. It'll be for him. For the story. For the control. I'm leaving this tape as proof. I'm signing a copy of my will. And I'm putting everything I have, my trust fund, my shares, the deed to the Bitterroot cabin in Ellie's name, with you as her guardian. Because blood doesn't make a father. Love does. And I loved her, Clara. I loved her so much I stopped running. There was a pause. Then Jack's voice returned quieter. If she ever asks, tell her I sang to her, that I held her at night, that I tried, that I wanted her, and tell her if you can that I was proud of the woman who raised her. Click. Silence. They sat for a long time after the recording ended, not speaking, not moving, just letting the weight of the words sink in. Then Clara stood and walked over to the window. Snow clung to the glass like breath. He never told me, she whispered. He never said goodbye. Sawyer rose beside her. He said everything he needed to. She turned, tears sliding down her cheeks, but her eyes were sharp. Can this help us in court? Sawyer nodded. Margot's already on her way. We'll have the audio authenticated, matched with his will, and submitted as part of our response. Between this and the documents Desmond's preparing, he trailed off. It's a turning point, Clara. No, she said softly. It's the beginning of the end. 3 days later, they filed a formal counter-motion in the custody case, petition for guardian validation and child legacy rights. Attached were Jack Ellison's notarized will, the original tape, financial documentation confirming the deed transfer to Ellie, a sworn affidavit from Margot Yates, and the official transcript of Jack's recorded message. Clara watched as the judge's clerk accepted the folder, stamped it, and slid it into the queue. Outside, the media was already circling like birds, sensing a shift in the wind. Reporters shouted questions as Clara emerged with Desmond and Margot. Sawyer followed a step behind his cowboy hat, low against the flurrying snow. Ms. Winfield, are you claiming the Ellison fortune on behalf of the child? No, Clara replied firmly. We're claiming her name. Is the family prepared for a court battle? She already has a family, Clara said. We're prepared to protect it. They didn't linger. The car was waiting. Inside, Margot handed Clara a copy of the transcript, underlined in red at the final passage. Blood doesn't make a father. Love does. Margot spoke quietly. When we read that in court, they won't just hear Jack's voice. They'll feel it. Clara nodded. Let's make sure they do. That evening, Clara sat at the edge of Ellie's bed once more. The little girl clutched Mr. Rabbit in one hand, the other resting gently on her mother's arm. Can I tell you a secret? Ellie whispered. Clara smiled. Of course, I heard Grandpa Sawyer crying in the barn. Clara's breath caught. Ellie nodded solemnly. He thought no one heard. But I did. What did you do? Clara asked softly. I hugged him after. Like you do for me? Clara blinked back tears. Ellie, do you ever miss your daddy? The girl nodded. Sometimes. I don't remember his voice, but I feel warm when I look at his picture. Clara leaned down and kissed her forehead. I think that's his love. Still here. Still with us. Ellie smiled. Like the snow. Even when it melts, it comes back. Clara nodded. Yes, baby. Just like that. The courtroom was colder than Clara expected. Not physically, but in the silence that settled just before the judge entered. A stillness heavy with scrutiny, with legacy, with years of silenced truths pressing against the polished walls and the oak benches. This was no longer about paperwork. It was about names and who had the right to carry them. Ellie sat beside Clara at the plaintiff's table, dressed in a soft navy blue dress with white lace at the collar. Her hands were folded neatly on her lap, clutching Mr. Rabbit under the table like a talisman. Across the room sat James Ellison Sr., flanked by 3 attorneys in sharp suits, his eyes pale and unwavering, fixed on Clara, with the calm of a man used to winning until someone dared to remember. Judge Lorraine Mendoza entered briskly, her black robe billowing slightly as she took her seat. A woman in her early 60s with salt and pepper hair and eyes like carved glass. Mendoza had built her reputation on cases just like this, where power tried to outshout truth. Court is now in session, the bailiff announced. In the matter of Ellison versus Winfield, Desmond Hale rose first. His presence quiet, but commanding. His tone was even respectful, but filled with a kind of weight that made every ear lean forward. Your Honor, today's case is not simply about custody. It is about identity, about a child born into love, not scandal, about a promise a man made before he died, and a truth that power has tried desperately to erase. He held up Jack's will. This document verified and witnessed declares Miss Clara Winfield, the legal guardian of Ileana Grace Ellison, his daughter. Desmond's voice softened, and in a cassette tape submitted as Exhibit A, the late Jack Ellison states clearly repeatedly that he feared his own father would try to control the narrative of his daughter's life just as he'd controlled his. He paused. This is not a case of a child in danger. This is a case of a family under siege by its own name. The opposing counsel, David Varnett, stood next. He was smooth, silver-haired, and had a courtroom smile that felt too practiced. Your Honor, he began. We do not dispute that Jack Ellison may have had strong emotions at the time of that recording, nor do we question Miss Winfield's affection for the child. What we question, what the law must question, is whether those sentiments override what is best for Eliana. He turned toward Clara briefly, before addressing the judge again. She lives in modest housing, has no formal financial infrastructure to support the child long-term, and until recently had no legal standing. He held up a stack of folders. We offer documents showing James Ellison Sr. has already established a trust fund educational plan and has begun arrangements for specialized counseling for the child's well-being. Interesting, Mendoza said, dryly flipping through a page. These arrangements were made after the petition was filed. Varnett cleared his throat. Correct, Your Honor, but with urgency and commitment. Then came the moment Clara had prepared for, but still dreaded Ellie's evaluation. The court-appointed psychologist, Dr. Maren Jacobs, took the stand. She was soft-spoken mid-50s, with the kind of eyes that saw through smiles. I spent 3 hours with Ileana Grace over 2 sessions, she began. In both, she identified Ms. Winfield as Mommy. Her attachment is secure, stable, and primary. Any removal would likely result in trauma. Varnett stood. Doctor, were you aware of the recent media exposure the child has undergone while under Ms. Winfield's care? I was Jacobs replied. And Ileana showed awareness, but not distress. Her safety net is emotional, not external. That net is Clara. And what of Mr. Ellison Sr., you won't tort? Dr. Jacobs folded her hands. The child does not recognize him. To her, he is a stranger. The words rang like a bell. During the break, Sawyer approached the witness list posted outside the courtroom doors. His own name was printed there, followed by hostile witness Ellison family. He smirked under his breath. Never thought I'd be a threat to my own bloodline. Clara joined him. You don't have to testify if you're not ready, she said. Yes, I do, Sawyer replied. Jack would have wanted someone to say what he never could. He turned to her. You gave him back to me, Clara, even after everything. I can't fix what I missed. but I can make sure Ellie never has to wonder." She squeezed his hand. "Then let's finish this." When court resumed, Sawyer took the stand. He spoke slowly, carefully. Not like a man testifying in court, but like a father writing a letter he never thought he'd send. "I raised Jack in a house where silence passed for strength," he said. "I taught him to bury pain, not speak it. And I didn't listen when he tried." He turned toward his father, then to the judge. "My son died trying to protect a truth this family wasn't brave enough to admit. But that little girl," he pointed gently to Ellie, "she deserves better. Not just our name, but the honesty we never gave Jack." Judge Mendoza watched him unmoving. "Do you support Ms. Winfield's custody?" "With everything I've got," Sawyer replied. "And I'd trade the Ellison name tomorrow if it meant Ellie could grow up free of its weight." A murmur swept through the courtroom. Even James Sr. looked for the first time unsure. As the day ended, the judge adjourned court until Monday. Outside, reporters clamored for statements. Margot shielded Ellie with her coat. Clara gave no interviews. But Desmond leaned in and whispered, "We've got momentum. And we've got Jack's voice echoing in that room. That matters." Clara nodded. "Now we just need the judge to listen." Desmond smiled. "She already is." That night, as snow fell softly on Bellevue, Ellie sat by the window, with Mr. Rabbit humming a tune Jack once sang, though she couldn't remember where she heard it. Sawyer stood in the doorway listening. "I never imagined," he whispered, "that the name I worked my whole life to protect would need to be stripped away to save something better." Clara joined him, resting her head on his shoulder. "Maybe that's what legacy really means," she said. "Not the name we leave behind, but the truth we finally say out loud." The gavel hit wood like thunder in a chapel. "All rise," the bailiff called. Clara stood, Ellie's small hand wrapped tightly in hers, Mr. Rabbit tucked under the child's arm like a soldier reporting for duty. Margot stood beside them, her eyes red but fierce. Sawyer remained still solemn in the front row, his hat respectfully removed, clasped in both hands like a silent prayer. Judge Lorraine Mendoza adjusted her glasses as she scanned the room. Her expression was unreadable, neither stern nor soft, but something quieter. Resolved. This court has reviewed all evidence, testimonies, and exhibits submitted in the matter of guardianship and custody of Ileana Grace Ellison. She began, her voice even firm. Clara held her breath. Ellie looked up at her, sensing the stillness. The law must always prioritize the well-being of the child above legacy sentiment or status. A pause. "In this case, I find the late Mr. Jack Ellison's will to be valid and enforceable. Furthermore, the audio testimony presented has been authenticated and provides significant weight to the intent of the deceased." James Ellison Sr. didn't blink. He sat motionless, hands folded, his entire posture carved from stone. Judge Mendoza continued. "Clara Winfield has served as the child's primary emotional and physical caregiver. Psychological evaluation confirms a secure attachment. Financial oversight will be placed in trust, managed jointly by the estate's trustee and court-appointed oversight." She looked directly at Clara. "Effective immediately, you are granted full legal guardianship of Ileana Grace Ellison." The courtroom didn't erupt. It exhaled. Clara stood frozen for half a beat, like someone learning to breathe again. Then Ellie's arms wrapped around her waist face, buried in her coat, and the sob that escaped Clara's throat was silent, but deep. Sawyer closed his eyes. Margot reached for Clara's shoulder. Even Judge Mendoza seemed to pause, her gaze softening for the briefest moment, before she added, "This court stands adjourned." Outside, the sky was breaking open. Not with snow, but light. The clouds, thick all morning, had finally parted to reveal a band of blue stretching over the mountains, like a slow-coming blessing. Reporters lined the courthouse steps, but no one stopped for interviews. Not today. Sawyer led the way through the side entrance. Clara held Ellie close, her lips brushing her daughter's temple. "You did so good, baby," she whispered. Ellie looked up. "We can go home now." Clara smiled, eyes damp. "Yes. We're going home." Back at Bellevue Cemetery, the snow had begun to melt in patches, revealing glints of green beneath the white. They hadn't planned to return today, but something in Clara's chest pulled her there, as if part of this story needed to be told under Jack's name. The headstone stood quiet and simple. Jack Ellison, 1986, 2020. He tried to rewrite the story. Clara knelt beside it. Ellie sat in the grass nearby, playing with a patch of wild daisies sprouting through the frost. She placed a hand gently on the cold granite. "They tried to erase you," she whispered. "But your voice, your truth, it spoke louder than their money." She reached into her coat and took out something small, a stone. Smooth gray and engraved with Ellie's full name. Eliana Grace. Ellison loved, protected, chosen. Clara placed it beside Jack's headstone. "She belongs to both stories. Now," she said softly, "yours, and the one we're building." Sawyer stepped beside her. Jack would have liked that he murmured. Clara turned to him. And you, Sawyer, looked at the two stones, side by side. Then at Ellie, who was now picking petals and whispering to Mr. Rabbit. "I used to think the Ellison name was a crown," he said. "Then I thought it was a curse." He looked at Clara. "Now I see it was just a name. What matters is the love written underneath." That evening, the house on Bitterroot Hill was filled with warm light and the smell of cinnamon from the stove. Margot had insisted on baking. To mark the new chapter, she declared. They ate together, Clara, Ellie, Sawyer, Margot, and two neighbors who'd come by with a bottle of cider and tears in their eyes. No one talked about the court. They talked about spring, about Ellie's drawing of a flying dog, about the old barn and what it might become. Later, when the plates were cleared and laughter faded into soft hums, Sawyer brought out something wrapped in linen. It was a framed photo. Jack, holding Ellie, laughing, one of the only images Clara had never seen. He kept it in the cabin, Sawyer said. "I thought you should have it." Clara took it carefully. Tears welled, but she smiled. "Thank you." She placed it on the mantel above the fire next to a fresh bouquet and a single smooth stone. Ellie looked up at it and said, "That's my daddy." "Yes, baby," Clara said. "It is." As night settled in the world outside, wrapped itself in quiet. Clara stood at the window, looking out at the horizon, the distant snow-covered ridgeline, the slow drift of stars. Sawyer joined her. "What now?" he asked gently. Clara didn't answer right away. Then, "We live," she said. "We love. We teach Ellie that names don't define us, choices do." She looked at him. "And we start again. Not from scratch, from truth." Sawyer's eyes softened. "I'd like to be part of that." She smiled. "You already are." The first spring snow came late that year. It fell soft and slow over Bitterroot Hill, dusting the newly blossomed crocuses, covering the fence posts in delicate white. It wasn't the heavy brooding snow of winter, but something gentler. A reminder. A grace note. Clara stood at the edge of the garden, Ellie on her hip, both wrapped in the same old quilt Sawyer had brought down from the attic weeks earlier. The stones were visible now, the markers lining the hilltop that held Jack's final words. Beside his, the smaller stone bearing Ellie's name caught the snow like a cradle. In between them, the space had been cleared for wildflowers. "I think he'd like this," Clara whispered. Ellie nodded, though she didn't fully understand. "Are they sleeping, in a way?" Clara said. "But they're always listening. The girl nestled her cheek into her mother's shoulder. "Do you think Daddy knows I won the big coloring contest at school?" Clara smiled, eyes glistening. "I think he was right there next to you when you won. And when I fell off the swing and didn't cry, especially then." Back at the house, Margot was in the kitchen with Sawyer trying and failing to explain how to make her grandmother's honey biscuits. "It's all in the wrist," she said, guiding his hand over the bowl. "Lady, this wrist's been roping cattle since Clinton was president," Sawyer said, chuckling. "Well, now it's going to learn how to fold dough like a Southern woman." Clara watched them from the doorway and smiled, not because it was funny, though it was, but because of how normal it all felt, how far they'd come. She stepped out onto the porch. The snow was still falling, but in the way it sometimes did in Montana, just enough to remind you that seasons didn't always listen to calendars. The wind shifted, and something caught her eye. Ellie standing in her little boots, placing tiny stones in a line in the snow. "Sweetheart, what are you doing?" Ellie turned around, beaming. "I'm making a path for people who are lost." Clara felt something warm rise in her throat. "Why, baby?" "Because the stones will help them find the love." Later that afternoon, a letter arrived. It was from James Ellison. Senior Clara sat at the kitchen table, while Ellie napped the others, busy baking and humming to old country tunes on the radio. She opened the envelope with cautious hands. "Clara, I won't pretend to understand you, but I saw my son in that courtroom more than I ever allowed myself to see when he was alive. I heard his voice, and it shamed me. I've stepped down from the board. My attorneys will ensure the trust remains in place with no conditions. Eliana will never hear my name unless she chooses to. If she ever wants to meet me, I will come with nothing but my apology. If not, I will carry the silence I created. You did what I never could. You loved Jack for who he was, not what I expected him to be. I'm sorry. James Ellison, Sr." Clara folded the letter and let it sit in her lap. She didn't feel triumph, only something quieter. Peace. Spring arrived in layers that year. One day it would snow. The next would smell like honeysuckle and wet pine. The barn that once held secrets now held life. Sawyer and a few neighbors had started turning it into a workshop for veterans. They need purpose, he'd said, not pity. Clara had painted the sign herself, Jack's Place for New Starts. Ellie helped paint the E backward. They kept it that way. On the first Saturday in May, the community gathered on the hill for a dedication. Wildflowers swayed in the breeze. Margot read a poem. Sawyer said a prayer. Clara stood with Ellie's hand in hers and didn't speak, but everyone understood. And when the wind picked up and carried a swirl of petals through the stones, Clara thought just for a moment that she could hear Jack laughing. Not in pain, not in fear, but free. That night, after everyone left, Clara found Sawyer sitting on the porch swing, watching the moon rise. He looked at her, then out at the land. "It's strange," he said. "I always thought legacy was about buildings, names, money. Turns out it's a 5-year-old girl with a bunny and a heart too big for her shoes." Clara sat beside him. "She's his legacy," she said. Sawyer shook his head gently. "She's yours, Clara." The silence between them was soft, full. Then she reached for his hand. "You think it's too late to start over?" Sawyer looked at her. Really looked. It's never too late when it starts with love. Later, after Ellie was asleep, Clara walked out to the hill one last time. The stars were out, brilliant and cold. She knelt between the stones, Jack's and Ellie's, and placed one more in between them. Smooth. Unmarked. A stone not for memory, but for what comes next. Then she sat in the snow between the stones, and smiled. Where are you watching from today? We'd love to know your city, your story, or even just a thought this video brought to your heart. If this story touched you, warmed your soul, or reminded you of someone you love, please consider subscribing to Soul Moment Story so you won't miss the next chapter in our journey together. Thank you for spending this quiet moment with us. From our hearts to yours, see you in the next story.